course.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, it's an honor to be with everybody today. Thank you for tuning in. Now it's a really beautiful day here where I am in St. Paul, and so I know it's sometimes hard to be inside on a day like this, and I just appreciate that everybody had an interest in this topic. I think it's very timely, very important, and we have a lot of ground to cover. So I'm gonna get through the parts that I'd like to share with you as best I can within enough time for us to have some discussion at the end, because I always have a lot of really good discussion after my presentations. And I'm also used to doing this in person where we get to tackle those things as we go along. But I think for our format today, it's going to be easier if you allow yourself to digest a little bit, and then we'll see what we can take on at the end with the time we have left. So I'm just going to share a quick overview of what we're going to cover here today. I'm going to give you a little more information and give you my introduction. And then we're basically going to be going through kind of a suggested reframe, a different way of looking at co-occurring disorders, as considering that being mental health and substance use diagnoses, as well as sometimes physical or what would be considered medical diagnoses on top of that as well. Here's a little bit about me. I just wanted y'all to get a little bit of where I'm coming from as a person and as a professional, because of course I can only really share what I have to offer, which is what I have also learned from other teachers along the way. I don't claim to speak for any group of folks or any other individual person. Even those who have been teachers and mentors to me, I take and rephrase a lot of what they've given me. I also take responsibility that I have permission to share what I'm sharing, and that if anybody has concerns about that I would love to talk about it. If anything that I share brings up something for you. So I personally am Navajo and Dutch descended. And in our traditional Navajo way, we always introduce our clans so that everybody knows who we're related to, where we come from, and whether you might also be related to me. So we would say, Bilagana Nishle, Tuadlini, Bilagana Nishle, Tuadlini, it's not coming to me right now. I'm sorry. The Tuahadlini is my paternal grandmother, and the Kia'ani is my paternal grandfather, Kia'ani Dashache. And I come from the northwestern area of New Mexico. And so my mother came from the south side of Chicago, from a Dutch immigrant descendancy. And both of those things are really important to the way that I see the world and the way that I move through it. I am now married into a Ghanaian family, and I have 2 children. So we are raising these children who come from 4 tribes and 3 continents. And that in itself is quite a task. It has identity and perspective be at the center of everything that we do in our home, and what are the teachings and what are the values that we want these children to come up with. Of course, mothering has been a big part of my life more recently, since we've all been staying home a lot more. As a professional, I do practice as a clinical social worker here in St. Paul, Minnesota, with the focus on healing trauma. Many of my clients are either currently using or in recovery. And however, I do not come from that substance use treatment background. I have not worked in that setting. And so what I'm sharing today is coming from more my perspective from the mental health side. Just as a value, I'm interested in the greater good that brings healing to human suffering in this world. And so this is where I get to bring my heart and soul into the work that I do. And I really don't separate that from who I am as a person. I really use myself a lot in the work. yes, as the healer, but also as the relative to the person who's coming to me for help. And that definitely impacts the way that I approach my work. And then finally, I just really believe that Indigenous wisdom is a guiding philosophy for those of us living on Turtle Island, which is the continent of North America. And I want to acknowledge that where I am now here in Minnesota, there are many ancestors that came before that stewarded this land and that know this land, you know, as their ancestral ground, which is the Dakota and the Anishinaabe people, who have been very gracious teachers to me since I've been here. And then also, in acknowledging those who were here before us, it's those who have paved the way for culturally specific mental health work. I will be using Eduardo Duran's work a lot, and I've also been highly influenced by Resma Menachem, who's a local clinical social worker in the somatic field. So basically, just to put this out here right now, this is why I want us to start seeing things differently. The healthcare system that we've inherited is based on the idea that the body is a machine and that we can fix that by invasive interventions, you know, going into the body or putting pharmaceutical substances into the body. And that perspective, I would say, is definitely becoming less and less valid. People are beginning to look more toward holistic interventions and holistic health and understand that those indigenous foundations for medicine are still very much needed, because we cannot treat just the mind, just the body, just the heart, or just the spirit and expect to cure the disease or the hardship of whatever is happening. So you may have heard of mind-body medicine as a sort of a trademarked approach. This is also part of the movement toward somatic therapies rather than cognitive therapies, and toward alternative medicine in the healthcare system, and the beginnings to adopt even traditional native healers into integrating them into our healthcare and mental health care. So another really big thing that's relevant right now, of course, is the COVID-19 pandemic, which really is highlighting the disparities, which have always been here, but that American Indian, Black, and other vulnerable populations are not being served equitably and are not receiving the standard of care as other folks. The system isn't working for us, and so it really has to change, especially as America, the United States, moves toward a Black and brown majority, you know, that becomes a larger and larger percentage of the population for whom our system just is not working. This has become very evident in recent weeks, of course, with the protests, uprising, and the speaking up about state-sponsored violence, police brutality, and systemic racism. So I'm very encouraged about where we are as a society right now, that, you know, people are ready to talk about this. People are ready to look at different models and different ways of doing things, which is why I said this is a timely thing to talk about. So I see part of my role in this as bringing Indigenous wisdom as it can, and I believe should, inform our care for those seeking so-called treatment of mental health and substance use disorders, or disorders as we diagnose them. So how do we begin to do that? First, we need to have a really honest conversation about this history, about what has happened, how we've gotten here. Really, in the last 500 to 600 years, with the colonization of Indigenous lands by Europeans. And this is an international phenomenon that happens, right? This movement of Western Europeans colonizing. Of course, there had been many international trade routes and expeditions, so to speak, before this time. And yet this time was especially different and unique, following the doctrine of discovery, which you could research more on your own later. But, you know, basically this mandate that Western Europeans were to colonize, Christianize, and extract wealth from the rest of the world, and feeling that that was not just their right, but actually their duty. And so through that process, the medical world began to discredit and demonize that indigenous wisdom, which really came from the roots with Greek medicine. And I'm referring to the medical system because we, in mental health and substance abuse, fall into that system of care. So our healthcare system and behavioral health models all exist within that framework. And this is the framework of capitalism through the medical industrial complex, basically making this all about money rather than people. And I'm sure many of you have rubbed up against that edge in your work of, you know, feeling the tension between needing to be financially sustainable versus the actual needs that people might have. And then that idea that we're isolating out anatomy as a mechanical thing that we should treat separately. And then also the added in value of white supremacy, or as Resmaa Menakem calls it, white body supremacy, you know, that really shows up in the medical field more because of the color of people's skin, because of the physical presentation, and how white people have been treated very differently than Black and brown people in the medical system. And this is ongoing. Resmaa quotes a study even to this day, and I would have to research for you if you wanted to know what it was, but that a large percentage of medical doctors would still believe that there's a different pain tolerance across races and can cause them to have extreme bias in how we, the interventions that we suggest for people. So there's a lot of limitations to the system we're working in, and specifically when we're using the DSM-5 to diagnose or give a name to, you know, we're really deficiency focused. This is not a strength-based approach. We're looking at what's wrong, and it includes a lot of over-pathologizing, especially of ethnic minorities around the world, that there is a lot of implicit bias, and there's also just a lack of understanding, you know, some of the historical underpinnings behind these so-called disorders. And so we're not asking about the origins. We're not telling those stories. We're not asking to hear those stories for the most part. We're only looking at what's showing up today, and that might allow us to alleviate a little bit what's showing up today, but it absolutely cannot heal the underlying cause of these things. So our, the main reason we do this, of course, is to find out which evidence-based approach we're going to use. And with that, you know, while I am trained in several evidence-based approaches, and I do find a lot of strategies useful, that term evidence-based, you know, comes from a very narrow margin of possible interventions and approaches. Whereas Indigenous people, we know that our ancestors have developed over thousands of years, very time-tested, proven ways of intervening with imbalances, things that are off, things that go wrong in life, violence, trauma, sadness, grief. All of these things we have interventions for that we would call, you know, basically practice-based evidence, that we know these work because we've used them over and over. And the efficacy of those traditional interventions is, people describe this, different professionals that I've talked to describe it as 90 to 100% effective, you know, outcomes, that those things work. And then we look at therapy, medication-based interventions, and a lot of times the best we're doing is 30 to 40% efficacy. And so we're really part of this movement. In the agency that I work in, we talk a lot about validating cultural interventions, validating cultural values as healing and as helpful. And that, yes, we acknowledge there are evidence-based approaches that can be useful as well. But when we're working with our own people, especially, there are often better things we can bring in to help. Eduardo Duran also describes diagnosis as a naming ceremony. You know, how big a deal this is to put these labels on somebody as they're going to follow them for the rest of their lives most of the time. It also says that this is something that's more internal. It's happening with you. You know, you are depressed or you are anxious or you are an alcoholic, and that is extremely disempowering to a human being who's struggling against something. So the reframe around diagnosis is really to see those challenges as living entities that we are in relationship with, and that for anything to be influencing us, it must have some sort of spirit or energy behind it. So from a more anthropological perspective, you might call this spiritualization, right? That everything has a spirit, everything is interacting on that spiritual realm all the time, whether you acknowledge it or not. So these entities are coming to us, they're visiting us for some reason, looking for something, and that gives us a place to start as far as having a relationship with them. And that's really what the reframe is, we want to relate to these things in a different way, understand that there's something we can do. With the spirit of addiction, this is oftentimes, Duran describes it as a contract. A contract has been made. You pay something or you give something up, and then that thing is going to give you what you want, but it also requires a sacrifice back, which most of the time is human life, whether your own, someone else's, or something that really gives you life that you lose through the process of contracting with that addiction over time. And then another really main difference in his approach is sort of also Jungian, in that it's really values dream content as the subconscious talking to us. That dream content aids in recognizing the relationship for clients to see that relationship and the dynamics in it, and the path to healing of what folks might be ready to take on. We can get clues from their dream content. This perspective is extremely empowering, to understand that there's a path forward in your relationship to this thing that's in your life, or this thing that comes to visit you. And we're encouraged to use our manners, to give an offering, to be a good host to that entity, and to have a good relationship with it so that it eventually can go away. If we shut it out, it's usually when they tend to come back over and over. So keep in mind, I'm talking about, things that these diagnosed disorders, as each one as an entity. And for clients, it's really important for them to understand that it's not who they are, but it is something that is happening that can be explained. So there is a way, I'm going to move into talking about the medicine wheel as a different way of understanding our holistic health, and how this can help us look at co-occurring disorders. And the medicine wheel is a largely universal, but differs from tribe to tribe. This idea of the circle and the cycles of life that move around. The picture here is from, of course, the Bighorn Mountains in Wyoming, where this is a very ancient stone formation, rock formation, in this symbol of the medicine wheel. So this has been around for a very long time and has come to be used in different ways by different Indigenous peoples. But this is a holistic perspective of all of life working together. And the main idea is holding all of life in balance and harmony. So in my tribe, the Dene, we have this word hojon, which means that it's in perfect harmony. Everything is as it should be. Nothing is out of balance, and usually an illness or a downfall of some sort occur because things weren't in balance. This also helps us look at the cyclical nature of life, the natural world, and time. We're pretty bad at that, I'd say, in our contemporary American society, understanding time as cyclical. We're really stuck in our linear perspective of time. And then I'm going to use this phrase. I'll show some more on the next slide here, but this phrase, Mitako Yasin, which is a Lakota Sioux phrase referring to all of those relationships as one, everything being interconnected and interrelated, and that what we do always, has an impact on other living entities around us. So this slide is sort of showing both the Anishinaabe in the middle and some of the Lakota concepts overlapping around the edge here. But starting, we typically start in the east and move around to the south, west, and then the north. And so in the east, there's these ends up being divided into four stages of life, the 4 times of day, the 4 seasons of the year, the 4 aspects of ourself, 4 colors and 4 animals representing these different directions. And so this is just to give you guys a very, very general overview of how I'm using the medicine wheel in my scope of practice. This isn't something I expect you all to completely understand as a result of our webinar today, but it is something that you can look into more, as a way to frame anything, your life, your health, your family, and of course the cycles that we all move through. So breaking this out just into these parts of us, or what could be considered like aspects of our health, our mind, our body, our heart, and our spirit. I just want to quick, as an example, look at how 2 so-called disorders could be represented across this model. And first of all, a human being who is presenting as lonely or sad, we tend to look at this as what's called depression. Of course, when these lonely or sad feelings are around and they don't go away, it shows up in their spiritual realm as a sense of hopelessness. It may show up in cognition such as, I'm inadequate, I'm never good enough, and it may show up in the body as a pit in the stomach or knots in the stomach. Everybody is a little bit different in those sensations and how they might experience this. As another example, when we show up with feelings of guilt, frustration, this could be related to addiction. In the spiritual realm, a sense of no self-control, not having that spiritual groundedness to make different choices is a spiritual crisis. I can't stay sober could be the underlying belief. And then in the body, a lot of fire, a lot of heat, maybe around the heart or in the chest, or headaches and different sorts of fiery sensations that are taking over the body when that craving comes around, and this sense of powerlessness, that's presented. But this is not just a mental thing. This is really a whole person experience that's going on. It's affecting the whole person here. So what we're trying to do with using a model like this is to also get at, what's the historical cause behind this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about historical trauma. And as Duran refers to it, the soul wound. And just very briefly, very simply, I'm talking about that deeply embodied impact of generational trauma, of not just one specific traumatic event, but generations of war, disease, forced assimilation, oppressive colonial policies that have caused harm through both biological and behavioral learning. So what I mean by that is, through the biological learning, the kinds of hormones that are released in the body, or the way our DNA might shift to pass on our fears, our phobias, and even our grief to next generations, through biology. But then behavioral learning is also the other side of this, because as an example, the way that parenting values and parenting strategies were known when Native children were forcibly sent into government boarding schools, which were run very much like military training centers, and stripped of everything that gave them resilience. And on top of that, horrific abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual abuse happening. We had generations of our ancestors that didn't get to witness the kind of deeply validating and grounding parenting. And so in raising their own children, there becomes, this modeling of the abuse, a modeling of what was given, modeling of, control and egocentric types of coping that were not the ways that our ancestors always did things. And so this shows up again holistically in our family lines, in our ancestry, that we've lost access to that whole soulful type of living, the ways of life and the traditional life ways. But of course, what this looks like, and as it's presenting in our medical system, is that there is current substance abuse, there is current depression, there is anxiety, PTSD, traumatic stress is one of the actual DSM-5 diagnoses that I use most frequently because it best describes what is happening with this ongoing fear and sadness. There is ongoing sexual and physical abuse, and especially and most including and least talked about, incest within family systems, that there is abuse within that system that has never been brought to light, talked about, or much less healed. There is neglect of children and of the vulnerable. And there's, of course, a lot of disease and early death. So this is what it presents as. But to use the phrase, the soul wound, we're talking about that total loss of identity, total loss of resilience, and the loss of the right to live in the way you know to be right. Because rituals or ceremonies to heal were also ripped away or forced to go underground. And so all along the way, these generations didn't have access to what would have helped them heal. And that gets passed down over generations. This has been being talked about a lot more, historical trauma, which is encouraging to me in recent decades. And I have to acknowledge here, of course, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who first coined that term, historical trauma, and then at the same time, Eduardo Duran and the term of the soul wound, but how Indigenous people are beginning to see this in themselves, and how conversations with clients does help them begin to understand why they may be suffering in the ways that they are. It is clearly evident, of course, in American Indian populations and also the Black diaspora, the African American population. And if you feel that you need to learn some more about those historical events, I've included a resource here for you to look at later. I'm not going to open it up now, but this is a timeline of historical events through the colonization of North America. And you can see, every area of our continent, nobody was exempt from these traumas. And then on top of that, we have basic denial, or, these things just not being talked about, not being acknowledged by our national government, and conversations about a way forward typically don't include honesty about the past. So that's problematic. But I invite each of you to think about, whether you can make a connection to your own history here when you think about just the last 500 years, maybe whatever area you live in, and even just your own grandparents. A lot of people can go back to their grandparents, maybe great-grandparents, but where, how did you get to where you are, and who who made that journey, or maybe you are on your ancestral land and you have that deep connection. Maybe people have immigrated to your area and that has now caused contemporary conflicts or issues for your people. So just something to think about and try to apply to yourself, how that might show up for you. Because the truth is that we're all carrying that in our hearts, their bodies and our souls. All of us are impacted by these historical events, whether we were, on the side of the quote unquote historical winners or the losers, where our society is now. We all come from the same history. And so for some of us, it might show up as that perpetrator guilt. And for some of us, it might show up as the shame and the loss and the grief of what was lost. And to understand how widespread and frequently this is showing up for clients, only adds to the complexity of the clinical presentation, because each of those symptoms can probably be traced to past generations, whether the client is aware of it or not. And as the person sitting across from them or the person making the diagnosis, we have to be very aware ourselves of our biases and what we're coming from and how we might be impacted by these things too. The healing, I truly believe that collective healing and individual healing have to go hand in hand. Yes, our system is sort of based on treating people one by one individually, but if that doesn't somewhere connect to the collective movement, the collective effort for healing in their community, in their family, tribe, nation, whatever it is, it's really not going to take root. So what are some of the accesses to healing, the ways that we can begin to heal the soul wound, if we do look at it this way? And the thing that I've isolated in my work that I try to put all my energy into is resilience practices. Is that we know, especially Indigenous people, we know that our ancestors had resilience, that they gave us things, they gave us everything they could pass down, even when it was illegal to practice those things. There were families that held on to those teachings and those songs and those ceremonies so that their descendants would be able to use them. And I think this is true across the world. All of us come from truly resilient people somewhere back along the line. We had ways to deal with all of the traumas that might come up in life. We of course have had traumatic grief. We've had violence. We've had loss, famine, disease, war, as long as human beings have been here. And so to go back and find, what did people used to do for this? We're pretty bad at death and grieving as Americans. I don't know if people would disagree with that. I think it's so clear, even now with this pandemic and the high rates of loss that we have, we're just not able to fully grieve and process and move forward in a good way. So for individual and collective resilience, I'm just offering some ideas here. Practicing individual resilience really depends on being able to be present and mindful and be self-aware, what's going on with us right now, what's going on in my body, in my mind, and my soul, that I can isolate that moment of choice where I get to choose the outcome I want, instead of giving into those pattern behaviors or those addictions or the things that I just automatically go to because it's easier, because it's what I'm used to or what I know. But how am I going to choose the thing that really moves me forward in life and has me be my best self? I think that's what so much of our treatment comes down to, right? Is helping people find that place and be able to stand there powerfully. And we all, you know, if we're honest, we all have addictions. You know, we all do things that are harmful to us. You know, we do things despite them being harmful to us, and continue to choose them because it feels good or because we get some sort of relief from it. And so to pathologize addiction, of course, there's a danger element, you know, when it becomes life endangering or when people are no longer being safe. Of course, we have to take that seriously. And also, a lot of the folks coming into my office don't need further pathologizing. You know, what they need is that validation and normalizing that we all struggle with things and we all have to find ways to be resilient in our day-to-day lives. I also really recommend incorporating physical self-care with mental and mental health and emotional health, that even reconnecting to ancestral foods. And there's a movement called like Decolonize your diet, I think, you know, and eating things that have always been known to be helpful rather than harmful. Exercise and movement, as we know. And then practicing self-compassion, kindness, to affirm your own worth and not needing that validation from others. This is a big one that I include with collective as well, is just getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. I also have talked about with other audiences the idea of pain tolerance and how we, I would say as contemporary Americans, have done a really, really terrible job of teaching our children to be with pain and to be with discomfort. Our society is all about feeling good. It's all about instant gratification. It's all about you should have whatever you want. And it's just such the opposite. That is really, you know, a twisted and backward way of thinking about life, of thinking about good relationship. That's the root of a lot of this extractive capitalism and a lot of our excess while others go without. So we all have to do a better job of welcoming discomfort and being able to be with that. Welcoming also vulnerability. And of course, one of my favorite researchers is Brene Brown, and how she has been able to really isolate these ideas of vulnerability and shame, and that if we want to experience wholehearted relationships, wholehearted life, we have to be able to do those things. And they're not modeled to us very well, I would say. I mean, it's very few and far between where you meet people who will show you their shadow side or who will be forthcoming like with that. I think especially we need to see it in leadership and the folks that we put out front to make decisions about the collective health. Similar things, you know, for collective resilience. I just want to throw in here that I lead a group. Well, I'll get to this more in a moment, but one of the groups that I lead at my agency is trauma-focused family group. And all we do is go through the cultural values for family resilience. Rather than talking all the time about trauma and signs of traumatic stress and stress in the body, it's important to know, but it is also such a downer and really brings a different energy than when we talk about resilience and how do we counter the things that we don't want to have passed down to our children. So I just want to throw in, of course, with the racial injustice being at the forefront of our conversations, we really need majority group members to be more okay with this discomfort and to be able to talk about white privilege, to be able to talk about white supremacy as something that has benefited white folks in America, and to also be able to talk about genocide and slavery and the really painful history that has put Black and brown people where we are today. there's just no moving forward without that conversation. Celebrating somatic wisdom is really bringing back in, you know, the ways of dance and music and movement, meditation, and all of these things that have been evident in tribal peoples forever and that we've lost. So bringing those back in, especially being able to move with other people and with the earth, you know, to reconnect to the earth and to understand how that energy field impacts us and how we can welcome that into our daily lives again. Another area is really with this relational aspect of restorative conflict resolution and understanding, you know, when we understand the nature of trauma, how it impacts our behaviors and our bodies, it does widen the window of tolerance that we have for other people's behaviors. To reframe others' behaviors as trauma related. That's one of my clinical interventions, you know, that shows up in my notes a lot, that this is what we're working on, is understanding how trauma shows up in this family system or in this partner relationship or in this parenting dynamic that is getting in the way of having a good life. And then lastly, of course, I just think that it's super important that we move some of these values into changing systems, into recognizing where collectively harm is still being done, where systems have directly and intentionally harmed people of color, Indigenous people in every aspect of our lives, and where are the opportunities for change? You know, defunding police systems, great. What are the alternative methods that we have for keeping safety in our communities? In education, just the unbelievable trauma that has occurred in the education system toward American Indian people. And we wonder why here in St. Paul, you know, our graduation rate is only 50%. It's just atrocious to be able to see this so clearly, why our Native families are not succeeding in our schools. And we haven't really done much to change that still. So a lot of work to be done, and depending on all of us. And I'm just gonna throw out this term, which I have used already, but I wanna just clarify what I mean by it and encourage folks to think about it more. With decolonizing, decolonizing is not just for Indigenous folks to go back to Indigenous lifeways. It's identifying and changing all the harmful values and ideas that have come from European colonization of Indigenous lands over the past 500 to 600 years. So I've named some here that, in my opinion, are some of those. And, you know, I think that even in the Dutch side of my family, we have some decolonizing work to do, to go back and to understand, where did this value come from? And if folks are experiencing harm from it, how do we begin to change that? So that's all I mean when I use that word. All right, we are getting close here. I want to leave some time, and this is sort of my ending submission to you all, is what has been so valuable for me in living in this part of the country and learning from the tribes here is this traditional value systems. You know, I wasn't taught my tribal traditional values, and I've been just at times shocked, and at other times just really inspired by learning, how did our ancestors used to do things? What was the value that prevented, you know, those breakdowns and those negative coping habits? Those are the things that we should be going back to in our healing models and in how we work with folks. This is really the root of moving forward as a tribal group, or as a community, as a human family. I'll take you through, and this is when I was talking about my group that I facilitate. We do a 10-week group, and we spend 1 week on each of these 7 teachings. And I would add that with the Lakota people, I believe it is 9. And so they have a couple of more, such as compassion, that gets brought in here into this list. But these are the words are actually action verbs. These are as translated by James Bukolich, who's also at the University of Minnesota, who is an Ojibwe instructor in the community. These are his translations of how these are really, they're action nouns, sorry. So they are things, but they are like living, moving things. That love, this concept of love, Zagi Dwin, the internal flowing out of us. One of my go-to favorites that I talk about all the time is Vinaji Dwin, respect, that they go easy on each other, that the idea of respect is not that you have all these specific protocols, but it's that you go easy on that person, or even going easy on a resource. You know, you don't over extract a resource that you depend on. You let other life forms be as they were meant to be, and you only take what you need. Living out of courage, you know, even in the Brene Brown sense of confronting our vulnerability, we have to have strong hearts. We have to always move from our strong hearts and make choices that are sometimes very, very difficult to follow through with. This word for wisdom is actually seeing things as they are, not having all this knowledge that, you know, sage level wisdom that's almost unacquirable to most people, but actually just being willing to look and see what's there. Having humility, of course, you know, to not think oneself more important, and also to not think oneself as less important, but to find that place of balance where we can relate to others out of humility. Living with righteousness, I see this as, you know, it's interesting how honesty is translated this way, but really having nothing to hide, having nothing to be ashamed of either, because we can move through life being satisfied with our choices and the lessons that we've learned. And then lastly, with truth, I love this translation as well, that we just can't describe that eternal, that life force, the thing that is in all of us, the thing that connects all of us. That is what's real. And yet we can't even talk about it. There's no word for it. You know, it's so sacred and it's so powerful and it's so beautiful and amazing. And we get to rest in it, in this existence. I think one of the greatest disservices to our mental health systems and medical systems is that we have taken the spirit and the soul out of it and expected people to get well without that crucial part of themselves. So however you hear this material, however you relate to it, you know, I'm not saying that everybody has to everyone has to adopt Indigenous ways. Certainly that wouldn't be right for everybody to do. But that in this value system, you know, these are universal. These are things that are part of your ancestry somewhere. If you go back and learn or look, there are all around the world, you know, practices and ceremonies to help keep people in balance. And I think the way I see things is we have just gotten so far off balance right now. And those who still have a voice are crying out for change. So I implore you, all of us, wherever we're coming from, you know, to be able to really think critically about how our client populations might be impacted by the policies, institutions, and systems that we're working within. Where's there opportunity for change in that? And how might it show up within you and your own, you know, if you don't have influence or power to change those big overlying things, to just look at yourself as well. And how can you show up with that sort of presence that inspires a healing space, that creates a sacred space? And what can we do to minimize unintended harm? Before we go to the any questions here. I just wanted to include this as well, some recommended reading from my list of um, Indigenous authors on the left here. Of course, Healing the Soul Wound, which has inspired much of my practice, and Columbus and Other Cannibals, which describes the wetiko, the backwardness of Western values, and how that's the real mental illness, and that's what we need to heal from. And then on the right, these are non-Indigenous authors that Anatomy of the Spirit, to get an understanding of the energetic influences on our physical health, and My Grandmother's Hands for a deeper dive into racialized trauma. All right, so I know we're a little on time. I'll see Joe, turn it over to you to see if there's any good discussion we could bring forth with the time we have left.
Thank you so much, Sierra. No doubt about it. This is your show. We have so many great questions. If you don't mind, I'm just going to jump right into it. Katie says, $1 million question. How do we get all of our paternalistic institutions to understand addiction in this context when they're so punitive, oppressive, one size fits all, and maintain white supremacy? Thanks for this information. It is highly validating, informative, and necessary.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. I think more of us have to speak up. You know, the more that we push that system of care to be less centered on the financial aspect, and to be more people centered. And it really is one, you know, of course, using your voice wherever and however. And it's also transforming the way you deliver care personally. You know, if you can't, if we can't just do away, you know, obviously if we just threw out everything today, people would probably suffer more greatly. And so, yes, in some respects, it's slow change. And I personally go back and forth on, you know, change from within or just start building something different. I do dream about starting my own type of facility or center agency, you know, a place where people can experience this type of revitalization of their soul and their body and their mind, to live a good life and to be healthy and in balance. I do think it might start that way, you know, of just more and more folks choosing to do it differently. But definitely speak truth to power whenever you can. And thank you.
Sierra, Nada asks, what does Americans being bad at grief, death, and losses refer to, and what would being healthy look like?
I'm mostly talking about the time frame with which we expect people to grieve, you know, in our very short-lived funerals, that we put people in the ground and have an hour or two of a memorial service and then expect people to sort of be past it, you know, to be moved on. And people even giving that message that, isn't it time for you to move on? In several tribal traditions, you know, there's a number of years following a passing. This is taken very slowly. And each year, you know, maybe for 4 years, there's a ceremony every year for 4 years that slowly walks the family through their grieving process and their letting go and their healing. And then they're relating to that person in the spirit world in a different way, you know, that there's still a relationship. And that because we interact with the spirit world, that because there's influence between the two worlds, they're not really gone. And so this kind of depends, of course, on your personal spiritual beliefs. But I do think that, one, even just the way we bury people in a casket and put all these corpses in the ground is terrible for our collective health as far as environmental health, right? And what we're doing to bodies and burying them, putting them underground in a way that they don't even decompose. Like, our bodies aren't allowed to go back to the earth. And then our funerals are also very suppressed. If people do really express their grief, it's short-lived, you know, and there's different ways where this like wailing and dance and movement is involved. You know, we know with trauma, we have to move those things out of our bodies. We have to expel that energy in some way. It's got to come out. And even after just a tense experience, you know, something that causes us a high amount of anxiety or fear, one of the ways to move through that is to do some sort of exercise or, you know, drawn out type of movement that moves the energy out of our bodies. And that's part of the somatic therapies, of course. But imagine, you know, if our funerals did last for days and did include a lot of movement and ritual and food and community and things that actually process grief instead of just memorializing grief and then being expected to move on with life.
Thank you, Sierra. Those are all great points. We have time for just a couple more questions. I'm sorry, there's so many great questions. I'm going to post my email here in the chat box. If you have questions and you'd like to connect with Sierra, Sierra, did you have a slide with your information on it? Either way, if you want
to. Oh, here we go. I'll put this up too.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Shreya asks, I think of self-compassion often in a context that may be colonialized. Do you have any suggestions for self-compassion practices?
I wonder a little bit what she means by colonial, but that a lot of our self-compassion practices today do come from Eastern Buddhist or Taoist traditions. I would think though that this can really connect to Indigenous values also by seeing oneself as not an individual, but as part of the collective body, right? So going back to humility and going back to the medicine wheel as an understanding that we are a piece of a whole and that everything doesn't depend on just us, you know. It's actually a pretty big relief to think that, you know, I'm not just responsible for myself, that there are other people who are in this with me and that what I do impacts them, what they do impacts me. We're moving through life together, and that takes some of the focus off of our ego, you know, of just our personal insecurities or self-doubts that I hope I'm making sense here, but I think that those things really are rooted in more of a collectivist type of thinking versus an individualistic way of thinking. We are so ingrained, especially I would say the feminine end of the spectrum, those of us with stronger feminine energy in us, it's so easy to go to insecurity, self-doubt, self-reproach. And I think that what actually helps prevent that is regular connection to a greater whole, regular connection to a body of people where you fit in with your strengths and you fit in as part of a village system or kinship system that prevents you from collapsing in yourself a little bit. Also having those rituals like coming of age, rites of passage are very important for establishing self-compassion, you know, and knowing what you're capable of and knowing how to get yourself through a hard time. I think bringing some of those things back in are very important.
That is great advice. Thank you, Sierra. And thank you everyone for joining us. That is our time today. Please feel free to contact Sierra. The email is up here on the slide. My email is in the chat box. I'll be glad to connect you to Sierra. On behalf of the Center for Practice Transformation, we'd like to thank you all for taking your time to join us today for this wonderful presentation. And we'd like to extend an extra special thanks to Sierra Yazzie for sharing her time and talents with us. Sierra, we hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Take care.